Grandmaster game analysis tonight and some game reviews. Should be 45 minutes of lesson, 45 minutes of review. I wanted to take a look at some of the older Grandmaster games. The older Grandmaster games are interesting. I mean, it's kind of one of the main defining characteristics of old Grandmaster games is kind of openings that haven't been in fashion. Another one is basically that their analysis tends to be pre-computer. So overall, the quality of old Grandmaster games or old World Champion games is probably like 2600, 2650. Still very high level GMs, but it's kind of interesting to see kind of the classical lines. They demonstrate different concepts. Styles of chess have changed. They've become less tactical and more analytical. And yeah, we can just take a look at kind of a few of the old ones. I think they're really interesting. And let's take a look. We can see Alekhine playing the Sicilian as black. I think this one's a pretty interesting one. I was just kind of looking through a few of these. But let's take a look at this opening line. So this is Alekhine playing Yates in 1921. We can take a look. E4, C5. So here, Alekhine didn't play knight to F6. Everyone knows of knight to F6 as being the Alekhine's defense. But here, E4, C, as opposed to knight F6, C5, and basically Sicilian lines. Knight to F3, E6, so French Sicilian, D4, C takes D4, knight takes D4, knight to F6, knight to C3. This is mainline French, nothing too surprising here. Bishop to B4 is not the main line here. These days the most common line D6. This is the Schwenningen. Or knight to c6. This is the four knights variation. Those tend to have replaced basically d6 in terms of, or bishop to b4 or a6 in terms of popularity. So looking at bishop to b4, this is the pin variation. We can take a look. Let's look at the evals here. Looking at the evals is always super helpful. I don't know how objectively different they're going to be. Let's look at, like, say, d6. So going into the Schwenningen variation, nothing's too surprising there. That offers white an eval advantage of about 0.5 to 0.75, somewhere in that range. Instead, with bishop to b4, this advantage looks like it's about 1.7. So bishop to b4 looks like a reasonably playable move. 0.7 eval on bishop to b4 and 0.7 or so eval on d6. So in terms of why this is better, I do think that d6 is probably slightly better than bishop to b4. I think that white can deal with these threats on e4 fairly easily. But let's look at what happened in this game. So bishop to b4, most common line for white is e5. This is the pin variation of the Sicilian. White can play e5, white can play bishop to d3, white can play knight to b5 if he wants. But e5 and bishop to d3 are the most common moves for white. Engine is suggesting e5. E5 basically puts immediate pressure on this knight, and will probably lead to simplifying on the c3 square. So let's see. Bishop to d3 was played in this game. I'm kind of curious about the e5 line. On the e5 line, black knight plays to d5. Queen plays to g4, basically attacking the king side, or playing bishop to d2. On bishop to d2, bishop takes, bishop b takes, and these pawns are doubled and isolated, but they're not particularly bad for white in this opening. This e5 pawn is not super difficult for white to hold. Overall, this is sort of a drawish position. Interesting, but drawish. Anyways, bishop to d3, e5, knight to e2. And basically, white's looking, white's looking solid here. White's up by about 0.3 here. D5, pawn takes d5, knight takes d5, and yeah, I think white's pretty comfortable. White's threatening this knight on d5. He's probably gonna castle or play bishop to d2 on the next move. Say castles, knight to c6, and basically white is at about 0.9 here. Knight takes d5 is going to be an option for white now. And on anything taking c3, you can play knight takes c3, knight takes c3, bishop takes c3, pawn takes c3. No, actually, we have plenty of games, TK. We're booked for about 10 days, so I'm not too worried about that. If anything, I guess I would say, the thing about people sending games is that they, is that they only apply really, or they most closely apply to one person. So yeah, happy to have people send in games. But again, I'm more focused on kind of the earlier part of this lecture. My goal is to basically, maybe I'll even switch it to being an hour versus 30 minutes. But it's an interesting thing that you write there, TK, and however is really fine with me. I learned something from every game. I think if people are here, they'll learn something from every game that we go through. So, anyways, interesting, but nah, I think we're pretty cool in terms of the numbers of games that people are sending. Anyways, knight to d5. Knight to d5 faces off against c7. Overall, this is kind of, this is basically interesting. Let's go back here. I'm sort of curious to see where these world champions, forked the theory. So basically, here, bishop to b4 was a big fork. So out of these games, about 3% come to bishop to b4, then bishop to d3 or e5. Bishop to d3, e5, knight to e2. D5, e takes d5, knight takes d5, and basically white's looking fine. Basically white's up 0.6 pawns. This is a comfortable game for white. White's got his development on c3. He's holding everything together there. He can castle, and white's situation is fine. Castles, knight to c6, knight takes d5, queen to d5, and yeah, smooth sailing for white. Basically white has maintained this advantage against world champion Alekhine for quite a while here. So a bishop to a5, b4, bishop c7, rook to e1, and white is comfortable. f5 is kind of an error for black here. Better for black was bishop to e6. What's the immediate follow-up for black here, for white here? Knight to f4 looks pretty solid. Knight to f4 is considered to be much more solid than c4. But knight to f4, this queen's forced to retreat, and the defense on e5 is that much more loose. Basically, if the queen plays to d6, queen to h5 is not an immediate threat. Bishop to b2 facing off against e5, potentially that could be good. But overall, white's looking solid. So anyways, queen to d6, fine. Queen to d6, c4, queen to f7, knight to c3. Yeah, so I guess c4 was not the right play here. The engine's recommending the pretty tactical knight to f4 here, or b4, but options for white. Yes, he was. So that's why I thought this game was interesting. Basically, yes. I was kind of expecting, old Alekhine's games to, be playing knight to f6 against e4. But this one is Alekhine playing the Sicilian. So it's not him playing the opening that he invented. It's him basically playing Sicilian openings, specifically the pin variation. c4, queen to f7, knight to c3, castles. White is fine, no problems here. And I'm sort of curious. I guess I'm sort of curious about how this one slips away from white. White basically has a good posted knight here. He can play knight takes c7 here immediately if he wants. He can play bishop to c2 or bishop to b3 if he wants. But basically white is fine. Knight takes c7, queen takes c7. That was evaluated as engine best. Bishop to f1. And yeah, white's going to probably end up exerting pressure on g7 throughout the rest of this game. If we're looking at this game, where do you think that the place that white should play is? That's kind of the question that I'm interested in. So I'm thinking that c5, b4, queen to a4, those could potentially be good for white. Rook to c1 also looks potentially good for white. Rook to d1. But all of this, I think is a pretty good play, pretty good way to move things forward for white. It's a solid position. It looks like it sort of plays itself. Let's just look at basically what I'm curious about is kind of the engine lines and how they maximize for white strategically, not tactically. Basically trading off the bishop and then starting. I think it's going to end up pushing the c pawn, trying to pass the c pawn. So I guess taking it back to this point, this point pre-trades, white's goal is basically to use his extra pawn on the queen side to try to advance. Yes, Miggy, thanks for asking. Yes, this is a game from Alekhine. My goal was to just look at some classic GM games. They're pretty interesting. They have some good strategic themes, but you can kind of see how they kind of basically with the absence of like really aggressive, engine analysis, they tend to have more tactics, and their positional play is different. I don't know if it's worse, but it's different than their positional play now. This is a very intuitive plan. c4 moving to c5, b4 moving to b5, and pressure getting exerted on the queen side looks like a good play for white. So anyways, rook to d1, queen takes, queen to d1, queen to c1, rook takes. Basically, this kind of destroyed white's advantage. If you look at this position here, white's got a pretty solid place. I mean, basically, he can trade off the bishop for the knight if he wants. He's got a bishop pair, and he's got an extra pawn on the queen side that has reasonably good chances of queening. So, knight to e5, bishop takes, queen to c2, and yeah, white has the ability to push forward on the queen side here. Rook d1. Rook to d1 was an error. Much better was c5. Basically continuing this attack. C5 would have put more pressure on white against black. He could have moved bishop to c4 and faced off against this king on g8. That would have worked. But basically b5, c5, and white is looking pretty solid. Rook a d1, rook takes, queen to c3. And yeah, white's plans, I guess, here, rook to e3 could potentially be one, knocking this queen out of this territory to the best of his ability. But I think the most idea is, or the most kind of consistent idea is to play c5, b5, and try to pass the c pawn. If white can get a piece for this c pawn, he's probably going to win this game. Queen c1, and now we're kind of, I guess I would say, headed towards a more drawish position. G3 is not as good as f3. F3 immediately challenges white's most advanced pawn. On f3, I guess I would think e3, but on e3, then you play f4 and isolate this pawn. This is a good tactic. Basically, I want to look at this tactic from an instructional perspective. So this type of tactic is actually very helpful. White plays g3, but the more modern tactic here, and one that I think is the best, is to play f3. Here, you have this issue where this pawn is, on the edge. Basically, it potentially has the ability to become a passed pawn here. But if it gets overextended, you're basically fracturing it. So here, e3, and then white plays f4. This is engine best. This is the type of move that the engine plays, and that it's a good tactical understanding to push into your game. But basically, this pawn hanging on e3 is really great for white. White can basically play rook to e1. He can play king to g2 and king to f3, and there's no pawn that can defend this here. So this is kind of a modern tactic. F3 is a much better move to fracture these pawns. If black ignores it, then you play pawn takes e4, and this pawn is the f pawn retakes, and then the e pawn's then isolated. But here with e3, you can take a look and isolate this pawn on e3. Yeah, they are really strong, and yeah, that is a I guess it's kind of cool that we have classic or basically good, well put together GMs now. I think the competition's just much higher. In the old days, you could really be kind of sloppy and win, but now the high level GMs are just clean and professional, and not basically there's too many GMs for people who are degenerates of the old GMs to win. It's like many businesses now. They're too competitive to have much margin for error. Anyways, this is a tactic that fractures the pawn on e4. Here, e3, f4, and white is better. So, anyways, g3 is not as good, but is played. From here, black's got a slight advantage, but white's main tactical possibility is to play things like b5, c6. Things will be fine for white. Yeah, cool. b5, sure. Pawn takes. And yeah, this position is slowly improving for black. Errors that white's making here, king to f1 is not as good as a5. White should basically be pushing aggressively on the queen side here. Black is pushing aggressively on the king side, so this counters it. But king to e1, king to f1, king to e1, and white is fine. No issues. c6, rook takes, bishop to e6, and yeah, looks good for white. Bishop to d1 here. Yeah, rook to b1, and yeah, all's well. Basically black converts this well. Rook takes c6 was the first error. Instead, b takes c6, and this position holds together more clearly. You can basically hold on to this pawn. This bishop's going to have to spend many moves trying to get, trying to basically get behind this pawn. But here, b takes is better than c6, and then once rook takes c6, bishop to d1, rook to b1, and rook to c5 is pretty much a fatal error. King to d4 plays here, and then rook plays to c6, and white is fine. So, anyways, rook to c6, threatening this pawn or this bishop on e6, and but white is gonna very quickly run out of play here. Anyways, h3, cool. Bishop to h5, and yeah, white is solid. Black is solid. This is a good demonstration of how kind of overambitious play sunk white, and overall good game. So the important points here. Bishop to b4 is not the most typical line. With bishop to, this is like an old line. With bishop to b4, which is called the pin variation, being played here. You play bishop to d3 to defend the e4 square. I guess this is called the Jaffe variation, but here basically e5, sure, threatening this knight on d4, knight to e2, and things are sort of fine. Castles, knight to c6, and white is good, I guess I would say. b4, yeah, no problems here. Everything's kind of solid. White has a good position. Things start to deteriorate for white though. So basically, f5 wasn't the sharpest. With f5, white can play knight to f4, yeah, no issues. Queen to c7, bishop takes. Just basically, white maybe not have maximized with that tactical play, but still things are solid. White's going to have this queenside majority and be able to push through with, basically push through with c5 and b5. Okay, so this is all good, and then the thing really shifts. Basically it's starting to shift here. White's not attacking aggressively enough. Black's attacking aggressively with his pawns, and then things really go badly for white once he starts getting restricted. B takes c6, better for white. With rook takes c6, I don't know. It's up to basically it's up to white to try to hold this together. But basically, white's moves allow aggressive play by black's rook and black's bishop, and the d1 bishop is lost. So, anyways, very interesting situation, interesting game. Yates versus Alekhine, and yeah, let's take a look at another one. We have Lasker, Alekhine, Marshall, Capablanca. We can take a look at Capablanca beating Marshall. I think that could be cool. Let's look at that one. Awesome. So. With Alekhine beating Capablanca here, d4, d5, c4, e6. Basically, this ends up being good for, this ends up being a win for black. Let's take it from black's perspective. I'm kind of curious about this game. Queen's Gambit declined. I don't know if he turns it into the semi-Slav or not. But no. So basically, this is a an e6, c5 line for black. Interesting stuff. Interesting game. C takes d5, c takes d5, knight f3. And yeah, black is good. Knight to c6, g3, bishop to e6, and yeah, all's good for black, I think. Bishop g2, bishop e7. Better for black here was knight to f6, but yeah, basically white has maintained the initiative through this opening. Tarrasch defense, and yeah, basically what defines it as the Tarrasch defense is this early c5. Pawn takes, knight to f3, knight to c6, and yeah, good stuff. Bishop e7, castles, knight to f6, bishop to g5. I like black's situation in general here. Perhaps maybe pawn takes d5 is better, but overall here black has played solidly. Knight to e4 is an overextension. In this opening book, there's a number of options. Black is getting, basically the engine is claiming that c4 is the best option. C4 is the best option. Castles is also fine. But yeah, castles here or knight to e4 or c4. Engine is proposing c4, and basically black is looking at castles here. So castles, knight to e4 instead. Bishop takes, queen takes, knight to e5, knight takes e4, or d4, and yeah, black's looking solid. So e3, knight to f3, knight takes, pawn takes, and yeah, black's looking good. Castles, rook to f1, or rook to c1. B6 is probably better, or probably best here for black. But yeah, sort of, considering that this is Marshall's basically gotten no, no tactical playoff here at all. Knight takes d4, pawn takes d4, e3, knight f3. Yeah, this is just fine. Black should probably castle here. Rook to c1, sure. I don't know. There's just really nothing. So, this is kind of a quiet, tactic-free position. The kind where Capablanca plays extremely accurately for someone of his generation, and Marshall may overextend. So b5, a3, c4, and black is just fine. Rook takes, bishop takes, rook d8. Yeah, no issues. Basically, this sort of, the moves that move this aggressively in black's position. C a3 creates this big, this big issue on b3, on basically the b3 square. If black can force, either, or if white moves b3 at any point, this pawn is effectively constraining b3, and if b3 is played or b4 is played, black can just sort of play queen to e7, queen to f6, and overall be fine. So rook to d8, rook takes, bishop to d1, and yeah, black's better. So I don't know. Here I would say that black's best opportunities to improve, probably like bishop to f5 and then bishop to e6. Again, black has the queenside pawn majority. This is going to be difficult for white to hold up against. But yeah, queen to c6, queen to e5, queen to d4, and yeah, overall here, sure, king to g2, but black's position is fine. A5, b5, a5, b4, and white is expanding on the queen side. So good stuff overall, strong. And once bishop to e2, b3, rook to d2, and black is solid. Rook to c1, bishop to d1. Yeah, overall, black has very effectively cemented his advantage. I think this might be worth looking at in terms of how one cements a 3-pawn versus 2-pawn lead. Let's look at these tactics very specifically. First, black has a better position, so he doesn't want to trade off queens. Black is basically on the aggressive side of this, so trading off pieces leave him with decreased winning chances. Queen to e5, queen to e4, queen takes, bishop takes, rook to d1, and yeah, I think basically black is fine here. The obvious ideas are like a5, b4, and the c4 pawn is defended, but the maneuvering here is just extremely efficient. So first a5, and by the way, this bishop is on the light square, so the dark square pushes are going to be are going to be the real, the good ones, I think, for the bishop. So rook to c2, b4, pawn takes, and the next set of moves is really where black breaks this open. He really plays this very efficiently, and that's I think a really kind of key part of Capablanca's game, which is that he plays in an extremely tactically accurate way with this going. So rook to b1, bishop to e2, b3. Okay, rook to c3 I have to think is a little bit better here. No, rook to c3 hangs it, right? So with b3, the rook goes to d2. With the rook going to d2, black can then push c3. And sorry, he does rook to c1 first. I think he can also play c3 though. Maybe not. Okay, so rook to c1. It's just a great rook and pawn technical endgame. Rook to c1, c3, pawn takes c3. So basically, this is the idea. This c3 forces a response on of this rook, right? Of this rook. So the pawn either has to take or the rook has to move. The rook can't move on this rank, and if it moves off of that rank, then white's pawn plays b2. So I really want to go through this. I want to do this again just because I think it's really important. Black knows basically from this point that he's going to break through on the queen side here, right? It's impressive how efficiently this gets done, but let's take a look. So a5, rook to c2, b4, pawn takes, and then white has options like c3, b3. That could be good, or rook to b1 here. But overall, this is going to be good for black. Rook to c1 is the maneuver. This provides tactical maneuvers like rook to c2 and c3. Bishop to d1, c3, pawn takes, bishop or b3, rook takes, and basically black is black is solid. So bishop to f5, and then this king can't really, or this rook can't really do anything. So rook to c1. And overall, this is now up a piece. Black is much better. So trading off for that, basically black forced the issue so that the rook was forced to take on b2. Rook takes d1, and overall, this ends up in a situation where black has strong play. That was important. Rook to c1, and black is much better. Like pretty much solidly winning with this extra pawn. So, anyways, interesting situation, interesting game, and I want to take a look. So basically, this game overall, was really interesting. The rook and pawn and bishop endgame was just extremely efficient by black. I think that's where this game, really, where these very high-level grandmasters kind of differentiate themselves. Even, basically, even pre-computer, their rook and pawn endgame technical play was just fantastic. The way that they force this, or the way that Capablanca forces this win here, is just really perfect. So queen to e5, queen there, queen takes, bishop takes, a5, b4, rook to d1, and then basically coming up with tactics where you can play c3 with b3 already having been played and being defended by this bishop on e6. It's just really, really good technical play. b4, pawn takes, bishop to f3, rook to b1, bishop to e2, and here, yeah, this is just better. So pawn to c3, pawn takes, and b2 basically forces the rook to sacrifice, the bishop for the pawn. Otherwise, it was going to queen. But yeah, just the way that this was done. The space sort of runs out for white. I'm wondering without bishop to e2. If instead rook to d2, staying far away from this. Because one of the things that happens is that this, basically this second rank causes problems on this, basically this second rank causes problems for this rook. So this rook goes to e2, and then black can play b3 or c3, but the threats are less kind of aggressive for black. Here, b3, rook to d2, the engine keeps wanting to get the king involved. But let's say h5. I wanted to see if there were lines without getting the king involved here. Yeah, I guess not really. This can't have been the. I mean, this was the engine line, but it can't have been the right line for white. Anyways, bishop e2 was definitely an error for white here. Just going back to this, bishop to e2 clogging this rook and making this not moving on the second rank. That was an error. So now b3 really, with this rook with limited mobility, black has all the tactics in the world. Like, he can basically play, b3, c3, pawn takes, b2. But yeah. Anyways, interesting situation, and ended up being good for black. So rook takes, rook c2, and basically black is winning. So another one, Capablanca playing a very good technical rook endgame, beating Marshall, and that is something to consider. Let's look at Alekhine Fischer. This is it's labeled as Alekhine Fischer, but I don't think that could be right. Yeah, that one's unusual. Let's look at Marshall Tarash. Okay, so this is a Marshall Tarash. All right. So looking at this, e4, e5, Marshall plays this early bishop to c4, knight to f6. Also, let's look at these accuracy scores. I'm just kind of curious about this. So say this is the game and we're looking at the report. 97.2 versus 98.6. Considering these guys didn't really have computer assistance, that is pretty impressive. Not a joke. So knight to f6, knight to c3, bishop to c5, d3. And basically this bishop's facing in towards f7. Yeah, no, they're great. These guys really are very strong is the main point. So I don't know. I love looking at these games. It's super helpful for me. So yeah. Yeah. No, those 47 games of 98. You see those guys kind of fail. Like, a lot. Even in high level games, grandmasters can fail. Pretty seriously. In order to match these types of high level evals. It's not unusual to see grandmaster games with like 88 or that kind of thing. But yeah, it's just it's kind of amazing that there's just a wide range of play. But if you ever think that grandmaster egos are insane, you can always look at their bullet games. And that'll be those are always kind of interesting. But yeah, anyways, this 98, 47, way too basically way too basically much. It would be way too high a number to have a club level player do that there. But these extremely old very good looking games. Those types of situations, those end up being the great games to look at. Great technicals, it's just it makes you really feel bad when you see how old these games are, and they were basically playing so accurately. So, anyways, I don't know. I guess it makes me feel stupid, but these guys are pretty impressive. That's the main point. So anyways, bishop to c4, bishop's opening. Marshall plays. Knight to f6. Okay. Spielman attack is what's this called. And basically, knight to c3, d3 are the two main options here. Knight to c3, bishop c5, and yeah, no, this is no joke for sure. Bishop to c5, d3. Black has options of knight to c6, d6, knight to a4, knight to b6, knight takes, a takes, and basically we're in kind of a fork. This was forked off of main theory. d6 first was a d6 first basically made it so that this knight could play to a4, threatening the bishop. Knight takes, pawn takes. f4, bishop to e6, bishop takes, pawn takes, f takes, and white basically manages to get doubled and isolated pawns in this main line. I really think that white is much better here. These doubled isolated pawns for black look weak. So anyways, e4, e5, bishop to c4 facing off against knight to f6, d3, and with knight a4, this knight moves to b6, knight takes, and basically white is fine. Pawn takes, knight to f3, knight c6, castles, castles, a3, and it is. I mean, these guys are far from incompetent and stupid. It's just amazing how accurately they can play. Options are bishop to e3 for white, h3 for white, and looks like a good situation. We're basically in the Spielman attack of this Berlin game. Knight to g4, queen to e2, queen take, knight takes, queen takes. It's about equal. Knight to d4 can be played, but man, these guys really are accurate. It's equal even with this. Even with these pawns on e5 and e6. Knight to d4, knight takes, queen takes, pawn takes, and the main point is just I guess here you can't be too intimidated about losing. What's kind of interesting is that I'm understanding. Let's see, this is on move 17, so I guess they do draw ultimately. No, they don't draw. Yeah, so that's what I thought. I didn't think that they drew, but basically, white is just completely unintimidated. Like, or black is just completely unintimidated. Like, this is a drawn position, but Tarash is basically going for this and saying like, I'm gonna win this situation. And anyways, that is that is kind of impressive the way that these guys are willing to basically win drawn end games. It's kind of a crazy thought to basically get into an end game that's a dead draw against one of the greatest players of the time and basically say, oh, I'm not going to draw this. I'm going to win this. And basically rook to f1, king to e7. But it's, in terms of the technical endgame here, this is going to be all, basically this is going to be all black from here on forward. Rook to f2, rook to b5, b3, rook to basically rook to h5, h3, and anyways, b4, rook to b5, rook to f4. White, basically black hasn't equalized here yet, and this is, basically this situation is better for, is getting better for black, but it's going to get better and better for black by the move. Anyways, b6, rook to f1, rook to a6, rook to a1. And this is looking good for black. I think this was a little bit mishandled by white, to be completely honest. White probably, like in these engine lines, white is aggressively attacking with h5 facing off against h6, g4, g5. And king to e2, g6, rook to f1, rook to a6, rook to a1. But basically all the pressure is being applied by black. Black sees this vulnerability and he's just going to keep pushing on it. So anyways, b6, king to d2, rook to a4, c3, and basically by this point, white is way ahead. Black is way ahead. This pressure on a3 is sustained. This king has had to move, basically all the way across the board in order to try to get into this. Otherwise, black just, basically if black takes this pawn, black will get onto the white side and win this game. So this king has to get all the way. Basically, white had to burn like, 6 or 7 moves just to get this king over here so that this a3 pawn would be defended. It didn't even work. So yeah, I guess what I would say there is rook to f1, rook to a1, b6, king to d2, and by this point, this rook is going to be making a sustained threat on a3, and the best, basically black does good pawn play that even prevents the king from getting in. So moving the king over never was a plan that was effective anyways. Pawn takes d5, pawn takes. Hey, thank you very much for the follow, Chess Quack. I appreciate it. Thanks for joining the stream. But yeah, rook to e6, d4, pawn takes a3, a2, and basically, white's going to be trying to push this forward. There's a tactical issue here, I think. I think that that a2 is not as efficient as g5. But anyways, white is good. So basically g5, king to d3, g5, and by this point, black is quickly taking white's pawns, and with this move, rook to e4, black basically seals the game with with basically 2 passed pawns. So rook to e4, and things are good. So anyways, interesting situation. Black is black basically wins a completely drawn game. At this point, this game is getting evaled by the computer as completely drawn. This basically situation, we can take it from black's perspective, is very drawn. This rook is on an open file. White's rook isn't even on an open file. Black has doubled pawns, and basically you would say, okay, well, black has doubled pawns, like white has this open, basically this rook. I would figure that that an even eval for black is generous even. So rook to a5, rook to a5 facing off, basically c5 could be good, g6, h5, and basically black is going to be, black's going to be fine. So rook to a5, king to f1, rook to c5, rook to f2, rook to b5, and there's threats being made by black onto these pawns here. So anyways, these high level games, they're kind of cool. I think there's still a good amount of inaccuracy in these endgames. But it is interesting to see how they kind of deal with this. You just wouldn't look at this situation and say that this is a and say that this is a good position for black. So, anyways, rook to e6. That looks good. But this rook still has an open file, and black's pawn structure should technically be worse. So it's impressive that black is able to win this. The real shift comes when the black rook starts threatening this pawn on a3. Rook to a1, b6, king to d2, rook to a4, and black is pushing. Hey, welcome, Alexandre. Thank you very much for joining the stream. So yeah, c5, pawn takes, pawn takes, pawn takes, king to e6, pawn takes a3, and basically black is black is good at this point. Ideas for black, how do you push this situation forward, basically? I'm kind of wondering about this engine line. So on g5, g5, b5, I guess draws, right? So I'm thinking b4 is a mistake because the king goes to b3. This rook goes to a8. Honestly, I just want these high-level grandmasters at this time didn't play this rook and pawn endgame right. So yeah, this overall is really interesting. So this is equal. King goes to e2, g6, rook to f1. Just looking at this, the best option is so the real key option here. Black had two tactical improvements here. This rook is on f5 with limited mobility. It moves to this file. This file is never going to be a good file for this rook. This rook can play rook to e. Cool. Yeah, good work. Good work, Alexandre. Yeah, definitely do. Play those 10-0 tournaments. I strongly recommend it. I think those are great opportunities, good practice. I think it may not be as efficient as, working on, I think it may not be as efficient as getting, tactical study. But it's great practice. And if you want to send over any of your games from that, definitely feel free, Alexandre. So yeah, I would recommend those basically rapid tournaments, and yeah, cool, cool stuff. But stick with the tactical prep, Alexandre. I think that might be a good place for you to spend some time. Rook to e6, g6, rook to f1, rook to a6, facing off against this a3 pawn. Rook to a1, b6, and basically black is going to undermine this, undermine this queen side here. c5, pawn takes c5, pawn takes b5, and basically, black's queen side is falling apart. So a2, b4, b5, g5, and again, black is, how does black basically maneuver this? Overall, hey, thank you very much for the follow, Creek. Appreciate you being here. Yeah, cool. So yeah, rook to a6, rook to a1, rook to a4. So the good tactics here. First, tactic one. You've moved this. Yeah, no, good work. I'm very happy to hear that, Alexandre. And yeah, keep up the tactical study. If you do 1 to 2 hours of tactical prep per day for a month, I think it will really, really help you pretty quickly. So yeah, I strongly recommend if you're gonna put time in, you might as well do things right, and that is what I would recommend, Alexandre. So yeah, rook to e6, king to e2, g6, rook to f1, and basically pushing this. Yeah, so that's a really good question. What I would say, gamer, what you can do there is go to chess.com Puzzle Rush, chess.com Puzzle Battle, chess tempo. But there's basically a lot of tactics training here. So I'm going to take a break from this, just since you've taken a look at this game, or just since you've asked, gamer. But yeah, tactics puzzles. So I'll show you a really good example. This is a tool that I use. I think for free you can get maybe a few, you can get a few of these per day. But if you just go to Puzzle Battle here, this is chess.com. Go to tactics or training, I think. Go to Puzzle Battle and just start and play one. They're competitive games. I'll basically hold this here. But I'll show you. Yeah, it just basically play one of these competitive things. There's a Lichess. It's called Puzzle Storm. I think it's free. There's chess.com Puzzle Battle. This is this one. There's a lot of free options to do tactics, but we'll just start a match. I'll do a quick match here just because I'm kind of interested in demonstrating it. And yeah, it's a really great way to do puzzles. You can do Puzzle Rush, which is basically this format, but solo. But this Puzzle Battle is great. Yeah, so definitely go with Puzzle Battle. If you just do as much of that as you can, I think you can basically set up a situation in which you are fine. So yeah, that's what I'm referring to when I say tactics practice. I recommend doing 1 to 2 hours a day of it for like a month. So anyways, here it is. This is basically Puzzle Battle. You're actually playing against somebody else. I find it makes things much easier to play against somebody else. It's more fun for me to play against somebody else to do this. So yeah, I strongly recommend doing this. If you can do this for an hour or two a day for a month, it's going to make you much stronger. Especially at the level where you're at, I would say probably 50% of games are determined by by kind of easy 1 and 2 move tactics. So you want to get your vision on these to be basically as good as possible. I'm just sort of playing through this. I'm not taking this super seriously, and I was just going to do a single game. But yeah, it's just this kind of thing. Like, these are 1, 2, 3 move tactics. They win pieces. They're not all mates. Basically, this this type of practice ends up being very solid and a good way to kind of improve. So yeah, I like the competitive ones. Competitive ones on Lichess or Puzzle Storm, and I think there's Puzzle Racer too is another one. I wasn't familiar with any of them. I'm lucky enough I have some good membership on chess.com, so this this option is available. But honestly, it's completely the same on Lichess. So if this option is not available, you can always opt for one of the Lichess timed options. So yeah, let's look at this. All right. Yeah, no, just get faster and faster, basically. That's my advice. Just really make sure that you just put in the time, basically. If you put in the time, there's pretty much nothing that anyone can that you will be so overmatched, or you will be so overmatching your opponents at the level that you're playing at, that you will be able to you will be able to improve your rating pretty quickly. I think it's the most efficient way to improve, and that's what I'd recommend. Pretty much throughout class level. One of the things is that people can't charge you to basically a teacher can't charge you to do tactics prep. So what they really want is to basically have you pay for lessons indefinitely and have you not improve. How you actually improve is this. If you want to get to later, you will have to go back and study and learn, kind of more thematic things. But if you actually want to improve out of class level, do this. It's just kind of I don't know. I guess I would say it's kind of, I would argue it's unscrupulous to not be straightforward. But every master has done these to an extreme degree throughout their play. So if anyone's telling you otherwise, or if anyone's steering you towards resources that might not be that helpful, I think that that's kind of a questionable thing to do. Anyways, this game I was lucky enough to win. But yeah, that's what I would recommend. 1 to 2 hours a day of this per day, and you will get much stronger. This puzzle battle is what I like. Lichess Puzzle Racer, Lichess Puzzle Storm. All of those are great ways to improve. Just take it from someone who has no incentive to mislead you. I don't want money for your lessons. I'm just telling you, this is how you do it. This is how you improve to 2000. Anyone else who's telling you otherwise is incorrect. I don't know what people are saying. If you're an improving class level player, I didn't have a teacher, for a very, for basically most of that. So anyways, yeah. So I think that's really where to spend time. So yeah, spend time there. 1 to 2 hours a day for a month, and you will improve. I have no incentive to mislead you. I want you to improve as quickly as you can. This is what I think will help you the most. Puzzles until you're probably 1800 to 2000, almost exclusively. It will really, really help your game. So 1 to 2 hours of puzzle battle, puzzle rush, those types of things, and I think you'll be improving as fast as you can. Anyways, let's go on to the game reviews for tonight. All right. Here's TK's game. Let's look at this. Okay, so TK is playing white here. He's playing E4 and C4 against the Caro-Kann. So this is an interesting opening. I think that what's this called? This is the Panov, right? I sort of blank on the name. Yeah, Panov. So this is the accelerated Panov with this immediate E4 and C4. This faces off against D5, E5, and G6. This ends up being a good way for white to kind of secure, material or basically secure center control. But G6 here, D4, and basically this has a lot of characteristics that are similar to the modern, but with the difference that D5 can be very comfortably played by black here. So accelerated Panov is what C4 is. Not the main line. Realistically, probably not as strong as D4. Let's see. D4 leads to an advantage of white of about 0.83. C4 leads to an advantage of about 0.3. So yeah, I guess I would say this is giving your opponent a little bit better eval. But C4, G6, D4, Bishop G7, Knight F3, and basically white's looking fine. Ideas for white: Knight to C3. Now white has a solidified center. D5 is still an available resource for black, but basically white has gotten a solid center here. He can play E5 kind of whenever he wants, and D6, Bishop to E3, castles. White's just fine. Better moves for white. I don't think there are too many. White's basically secured a 1-pawn advantage through 6 moves, and he hasn't overextended his center. White's center is solid. This is actually really thematically how you're supposed to play how you're supposed to play these large center versus modern games. C4, D4, E4, and basically this center holds up. Black center, these flank openings, pretty marginal here. In my opinion, basically black is playing for an overextension by white. If white just has a solid center, doesn't play crazy things like E5, which I definitely see people play. If white just sits back, develops his pieces in a natural way, starts attacking on the king side, he's going to have a really good position here. That's what I would recommend. Bishop to D3, white's developing all of his pieces and castling. This is just, extremely solid. Here, Knight to E2, basically, this H2 pawn is never really a realistic threat. Knight to E2, and you start having threats of trapping the queen on this king side. So here, H3 is inaccurate, although not terrible. Let's look at this Knight to E2 line. With Knight to E2, Knight takes H2 is probably the best option for black. I mean, already losing a piece. So anyways, overall, thematically, I think white's done pretty much everything right here. It's transposed basically from the from the Panov to I guess basically it's gone from the Panov to like a a modern type game, and by just following general modern strategy and attacking while maintaining a solid center, white's going to be in great place. Bishop to C2, F6, E6, bishop, knight to B6, and white is good here. F6 is inaccurate. Against F6, white can play E takes F6. In this line, bishop takes F6, bishop to E3, and this bishop's attacking this knight on C5. So anyways, this should lead white to be up by about 2 pawns. Things are comfortable. And E6, knight to B6, king to H2. Things are very comfortable for white here. Knight takes C4, bishop to C1, king H8. Yeah, in terms of white's play here, I think should be pretty solid. Knight takes C4, bishop to C1 is an error. On developing this bishop, better was bishop to B3. Which I guess makes sense. Bishop to B3 sort of defends this bishop indirectly. If bishop to b3, knight takes e3, rook takes e3, and white is going to win this knight on e6 tactically. The knight on e6 is kind of problematic for black. Like, this light squared bishop can really exploit that knight. So yeah, let's go back to the beginning. I just want to take a look at this. Basically transposes from the Caro-Kann into a modern. White gets a huge center. Black has restricted development and no challenges for the center. White's basically, his lead is solidifying. And ideas like knight to e2, to knight to g3, that ends up being good for white. h3 pushing the knight back to f6, e5, pawn takes. And basically, white is so knight to f6 here. White has good opportunities to exploit this this queen's displacement over here. Basically, with knight to e2, he's threatening knight to g3, and with knight to g3, the queen is trapped. The queen has no escape squares. This bishop is holding a5. Knight to g3 can be played. This queen probably has to go somewhere, but it can't. It has no escape squares. So what can it do really? Here, bishop takes h3 is the best way for black to eject from this situation. But yeah, overall, this black should be just about busted here. Okay. Anyways, h3, knight to f6, e5, pawn takes, knight to d7. White rook will probably play to e1. This bishop plays to f4, and white is good. Ideas for white: just solidify this, and eventually play for a tactic to win this queen that's so displaced and immobile, or that has such restricted mobility on the king side here. Knight takes c5, bishop e2. I guess it never really happens, but when after bishop to e6, or knight after so e takes f6 was much better for white than e6, but after this, bishop can play to b3 and put a strong attack on this this light squared diagonal. So anyways, this game is interesting. I guess what I would say here is basically this. Black capitalizes on errors and kind of an insufficient attack by white. There were multiple opportunities for white to improve their situation here. From here, you have an ideal position coming out of the opening, an eval advantage of 1.3. This queen goes to h5, which is really running into some tactical problems. With this queen having such limited mobility, white's strategy should be knight to e2, knight to g3, and trapping the queen. White basically doesn't do that. White creates a hook on h3. This is an error. Knight to e2, knight to g3 is a big improvement for white that will lead to an advantage. So, anyways, there's that. h3, 6, e5, pawn takes, knight to d7, bishop to f4. This wasn't correct. The best was to trap this queen over on this king side. After h3 is played, black is very quickly slipping out of this issue. Knight e2 is still playable for one more move, but after e5, things are kind of over. Basically the attack is over. So knight to e2, knight to g3, and white is better. The issue was, not this, basically not, putting time into preventing this queen from exiting on this 5th rank. You didn't really have to do that. This queen was never going to escape effectively there. This bishop's holding a5, and pawns are holding all of the other all of the other possible squares. So with knight to e2, this bishop is facing off on a5, and this knight can go comfortably to g3, threatening that queen. So that's white's course of action. By not pursuing this efficient course of action and trapping the queen over here, and instead playing e5, which decreases the ability of white to trap the queen on the king side, this situation gets much worse. So that's my point here. That's where I would improve as white. Move your knight to e2, move your knight to g3, and things should be comfortable. Things should be comfortable there. This just wasn't the correct tactic. I think conceptually it was the right idea. I think that you're looking at the queen. I think that e5 is basically played with the idea of trapping this queen in mind. But the effective way to do that was knight to e2, knight to g3. E5 just basically lets black get additional resources into defending the queen and solidifying the queen side here. Anyways, e5, pawn takes e5, pawn takes e5, knight to d7, bishop to f4. Yeah, this just didn't work out. So knight to a6, rook e1, knight to c5, bishop to c2, f6. You've really blown your big opportunity here. Pawn takes f6 was better. Knight to b6, sure, this is fine. White's fine, but the advantage, which was once as high as 4.8 points for white, is gone. So now white missteps a few times. On knight takes, basically bishop to e3 was fine, but on knight takes c4, bishop to b3 was slightly better. This puts this rook on this bishop on a very weak diagonal for black. So bad. Bishop to c1. Instead, much better was bishop to b3. And rook takes, knight to f4, rook takes. Black successfully executes an attack. So there's two really key things here. White played the opening very well. I really liked the situation that white got out of the opening. He was up about 1.3 points. Great, great, solid. You haven't overextended with your center in a modern game. You have all the opportunities in the world as white. So queen to h5, h3, knight to f6. And then but basically here, even as late as knight to f6, but probably earlier, the eval's about the same with or without h3. The move for white to trap the queen, knight e2, knight to g3. The engine doesn't even try to get out of this without sacrificing a piece. So, that was the move for white. That was the improvement for white. That was basically the decisive point for white in the game. After all these tactical, basically there's tactical inaccuracies by both sides here, but ultimately the advantage is lost for white. After bishop e3, knight takes c4, white has one more final chance to have a good attack. Bishop to b3 threatens on this weak diagonal, but since it's not played, basically black is now way up, and with king safety not looking so great. So those are the two key points in the game. Basically first the chasing the queen with knight to, basically threats of knight to g3 as opposed to e5. That was huge, decisive. It went from a 5-point plus for white to an even game. And then the second was not moving the bishop to b3 here. This was basically white's last chance to secure an advantage. I don't know if it would be a winning game for white, but this was way better than what was played, and I think pretty clearly the best option for white here. Bishop to b3 puts your bishop on a very weak diagonal for black. It offers you something. So anyways, interesting situation, interesting thoughts, and basically thank you very much for sending the games, TK. Always very helpful, always appreciated. Feel free to send them. Lots of people are sending lots of games, yeah, really appreciate that one. Those are the two ideas, the two thoughts there. Are bishop to basically trap the queen with the g3 idea, not the e5 idea, and then the second idea there is play bishop to b3, and try white's last attempt basically to get ahead there. Anyways, interesting stuff. Thank you very much for sending it. I appreciate it, and yeah, that's that. Cool. Thanks, TK. On to the next game. Next game I'll open right now. Next game is again from TK. Okay. I hope I didn't do this incorrectly here. Is this the same one? I got it. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, please keep stopping by, Alexandre. I hope it's helpful, and yeah, thanks very much for being here. Is your game isn't next, is it? If your game is next, I'll skip to it if you're gonna go to bed instead. Let me take a look. Yeah, no, your game, there's no more games. I thought you might have a game for tonight, Alexandre, but yeah, thank you very much for joining the stream. Have a good night, and yeah, hope to see you again soon. Cool. The next game is also from TK. I don't know, is this, let's just make sure this isn't the same game. I hope it's not. That would be annoying. If it's the same game, maybe we can do a simul. Maybe we can do a simul if we accidentally get an extra slot. Those can end up being pretty fun, so let's just make sure that this isn't the same game that we just looked at. If we get an extra slot, we'll do a simul. That'll be cool. Okay, cool. So these are the same two players. This is a rematch. White is playing. Basically this is a rematch between WIM and TK here. This is a game where the colors are reversed. So the same two opponents as last time. TK sends lots of games. They're interesting. Often against titled players. So I'm always happy to look them over. Cool. Here's the Elephant Gambit. Elephant Gambit is always really interesting. Let's see basically how TK plays the Elephant Gambit. Elephant Gambit, knight takes e5, d takes e4, and I guess here, basically this line. So this line I'm not as familiar with, to be honest. When I think of the Elephant Gambit, I think of pawn takes d5, which looks like about a 60% play. Now let's learn the knight takes e5 line. Knight takes e5 here, and then basically best move. The two options that are played for black are either bishop to d6 or pawn takes e4. Here, bishop to d6 is about the same. Okay, so there's no advantage of either of those two. D takes e4 is played for white here. Here, f4, d4, and bishop to c4 is a distant third. The engine is recommending bishop to c4. So this is kind of interesting. This is kind of a break between the, yeah, TK. Yeah, no, for sure, Alexandre. It is always interesting to see TK's game. He plays a lot against masters. We get to see master level play there. It is good to get some good instructional games. The masters play well. We get to see kind of more established opening theory, but that shouldn't be any reason. Basically people of all levels send in games. They're all instructive. We can always learn new openings. Basically as a master, no one plays unusual openings against me anymore, really. So it is good to see games of every level. They're all instructive. So here, pawn takes e4, bishop to c4. This is actually really interesting. So this early bishop to c4 facing off against is different in the opening book. This bishop to c4 looks like it's significantly better than any other option here for white, but it is not the preferred opening book move. So I don't know. Bishop to c4 actually looks pretty interesting. This looks dangerous for white, to be honest, or dangerous to black. Early bishop to c4, knight to h6, d4, knight to d7, knight takes, bishop takes, and white's sort of developing. Black can play knight to f5. Allowing bishop takes h6 probably isn't acceptable for black here. That's going to end up losing almost as much as a pawn. Knight takes d7 is considered to be not as good as castling. Let's look at the castling line. Here we're out of the opening book. Okay, so let's look at the castling line. Castling, knight takes e5, d takes e5, queen takes d1, rook takes d1, and this is interesting. Knight to g4 looks like the best move for black here, and white has a solid initiative, an open rook file, and a threat on f7. Neither the e4 pawn or the e5 pawn are particularly well defended, so black is choosing knight to g4 in his next move. And basically the engine is looking at lines where knight to g4 is played, knight to c3 is played, knight takes e5 is played. Overall good for black. So anyways, interesting. Knight takes d7, bishop takes d7, castles, knight to f5 is an inaccuracy. Here white gets to exert pressure on this e4 pawn. Looks good. Rook to e1, bishop e7, rook takes. And rook takes here, sure. Castles, c3, bishop to f3. But yeah, this is actually really volatile. I don't want to kind of go over this, basically the tactical errors here, but let's look at the report. This is bouncing around a good amount. Right here, this opening shifts by about a point and a half every move. So many errors from white and black here. I don't really like studying tactics, to be honest. Or basically I like studying tactics, but I don't really like reviewing tactics. The issue with tactics is I can't do much better than the engine can. No human can. So overall, knight to d2, rook to e8, bishop to f3, a6. Yeah, this is just sort of swinging back and forth. Main kind of underlying themes here. We have this, and by the way, this is a swing of about 3 points. So these are just huge improvements, or basically huge opportunities for improvements. So basically here, you've played the Elephant Gambit. The Elephant Gambit is, I don't know, a gambit opening. First improvement, queen to h4. Okay, so queen to h4, and you can defend the e4 pawn, and you can defend the knight on h6. So in the queen h4 case, if bishop takes h6, queen takes h6, and then threats from e1, you can basically play f5 or something like that, and be fine in this situation. It doesn't give you those doubled isolated rook pawns that are barely worth more than a pawn. Knight to f5, okay, is an inaccuracy. Rook to e1, bishop to e7. And here, basically, if the knight plays, if the knight plays to c3, this pawn on e4 is going to be won almost uncompensated by white. So that's a big difference. Rook takes e4 is a big blunder, though. With rook takes e4, knight to d6, winning a piece is playable. So I'm just going to say, knight to f5, okay, knight to f5 versus queen to h4 is slightly worse for black, but understandable. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, they may be. I don't know Lee chess as well, to be completely honest. Gamer games. If you want to look at another place where you can get free difficult tactics, basically chesstempo.com has a tactics trainer, and it'll just play to your level. So like the chess.com tactics trainer will basically give you tactics that are easier and easier if you keep getting them wrong, and harder if you keep getting them right. So chess.com is another excellent tactics trainer. It's not competitive one-on-one, I don't think, or I don't think they have that functionality like Lee Chess does. But if the main point gamer games is just basically spend 1 to 2 hours a day on tactics, and you will really improve by a lot. The easiest way for me to do it is on chess.com Puzzle Battle. For me, those are really fun tactics to do. It's fun to play someone one-on-one. It's fun that they have a rating system that lets you compete and do it. But chess.com versus chess.com versus Lee Chess, they're offering, one is free, one is not free. But the difference, basically the tactics are an important part of it. So anyways, queen to h, basically queen to h4 over f5 is slightly better. This allows you to basically hold the knight on h6 and keep your queen, providing defensive resources that you need. Okay, instead, knight to f5, rook to e1, bishop to e7, rook takes, and then your big move here for black is knight to d6. This wins a piece with knight to d6 wins a piece, threat on e4, threat on c4, and basically black will be fine here. Castling doesn't win a piece. This is much better for black. Castling is an error, so there's a tactical error there. Going through this now, white's a little bit better again. White's trying to cement an attack on black's king side, but I don't know. It looks a little bit, I don't know, flimsy. Like this rook on g4 seems very easily threatened and limited in mobility. Like I feel like black could just sort of play h5 here, and white wouldn't really have a great response to that. So I don't know. Knight to f3, a6, bishop to f4, b5, bishop to d3, and now white's up by about a pawn and a half. Things look solid for black. Bishop takes, rook takes, queen to e8. This was another tactical error. Rook takes e5 is a big error here. There's even material, but you can just deal with this threat so easily with like a conservative idea like bishop to g6 or f6. Sacrificing a full exchange in a situation in which you're already down slightly, not a good plan. So basically two tactical errors in this game at the end of the day. I felt like the opening, it's the Elephant Gambit, so it's going to be some pretty, I guess I would say, pretty raggedy stuff. Like these openings are not super, these openings are not super sound. I don't think Elephant Gambit in particular is refuted. I think it's just, I think it can lead to equality for white, but I don't think it has a full refutation. But multiple tactical, first this is a missed tactical victory for black. Knight to d6 threatens the knight on e4 and the bishop on c4. Good stuff for black against white. The second idea is, basically I don't think this was extremely accurate, but fine. But the real error and the decisive one here in this situation. Hey, thank you very much for the follow, Sai. I appreciate it. So this bishop taking on e5. This bishop goes to g6, and the threat's pretty much over. Black is down a pawn. Yeah, thank you for asking, Lauren. I appreciate it. So yeah, bishop to g6, and basically black is black is fine here. Not great. There's still a pawn down in an opposite colored bishop endgame. But this ends up being the difference. Bishop rook takes e5 was just premature here. There was no really reason to sacrifice this exchange, and there's a big corresponding movement against white in the eval. So bishop to g6 instead, or f6 instead, and basically black is fine. So that's my that's my improvement for black there. The first being you had the opportunity to win the piece with knight to d6 as opposed to castling, and then here's another one you just basically prematurely played rook takes e5. Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah, thank you very much yeah, I'm always very happy to hear about improvements, Lauren. I think yeah, I am Toth. Again, anyone who gives free chess lessons, I'm very happy with. My understanding is that he has a free chess lesson stream. Chess lessons can, should, and will be free. So yeah, anyone who moves that goal forward makes me happy. Yeah, soon chess lessons from probably high-level IMs and GMs will, live lessons will cost $0, and the world will be a much better place. So I'm very happy with that. I'm happy that I can participate at least in kind of the earlier stages of that project. But I think it's pretty much an inevitability, and I'm very happy that I've gotten to work on that project. So very happy to hear anyone giving free work, and really happy to hear that, Lauren. But I get the sense that's what he does, right? I mean, I don't know his stream super well, to be honest, Lauren. But yeah, anyone who moves the idea of completely free chess lessons forward, basically, making this free for everyone model, half lessons, that's great. Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I mean, I like the all free model. I think we'll get there eventually. I'm gonna be all free forever. This is something that I do because I think I think the world will be much better if chess lessons are always free for everyone at every level. But yeah, that's what's gonna happen. So anything moving in that direction really makes me happy. So I haven't seen his stream to be honest, but I know he's a big streamer. So anything moving in that direction, I'm happy that I got to be a part of it. And I hope at some point the IMs and GMs will be giving completely free lessons as well, and then I'll basically be I'll basically be happy to go back to developing all day. This has been fun, and it's been great for my game. But at the end of the day, IMs or GMs are going to replace exactly what this stream is, and then the world will be better, which was the goal the whole time. So. Anyways, that all makes me happy. Cool. Yeah. Yeah, quitting Blitz. I guess I guess I would say the main idea. You have great understanding of your your opening and end games. It seems, Lauren. But what I would say is it's surprising to me that you're not a more highly rated player. To be completely honest, Lauren, I think the games that you've shown me that you've played have all sort of made sense. So I think it's got to be tactical play. Anyways, yeah. So calculating versus tactics. I don't know. I'm not 100% sure. But yeah, that's the I've looked at a few of your games. My memory is that tactics are a pretty big thing. But yeah, any tactical training that you can do, Lauren, is going to help you. Either slow tactics, which are more calculation based, or fast tactics, which are just vision pattern recognition based. I think that's where you want to spend time. If you do 1 to 2 hours a day of that for a month, as I recommend to everybody, you're really going to improve. So I think that's a good way to improve it. The level, basically at all levels. But I think your the tactical side of your game is not in alignment with your with the strength that you have in positional understanding and opening in basically opening theory understanding. Okay, cool. So let's finish up this game. 2 errors here. 2 errors on this game. They were the first was bishop to e7, knight to d6 here. Knight to d6 threatens knight on e4 or rook on e4, bishop to c4. Basically black wins at least an exchange or a piece here. So castles misses that tactic. The second tactic, you're basically, I think there's some slight inefficiencies here, but the really decisive thing was, rook takes e5 was just not a good idea. Bishop to g6 or f6, and you've shut down this, kind of scary-looking attack on g7. I understand it's a scary-looking attack, but there's no reason to go crazy here. And you just play rook takes e5, and everything's fine. So bishop to g6, much better. f6, much better. Rook takes e5, unfortunately, a little bit too ambitious. So those are the 2 moves at TK. Thank you very much for sending the games, as always. And those are the ones that I would make edits to. Thanks for sending the game, TK. 2 tactical things, but 2 very interesting games against very strong players. Yeah, we've got one more. This is the Reels game. Let's take a look. So the Reel is basically playing knight to f3 against d5, c4, pawn takes c4. Okay. So on knight f3 d5, so basically the ready against the ready. So first, the ready's most common responses. Knight to f6 is number 1, knight to d5 is number 2, c5 is number 3, and g6 is number 4. Okay, so that's 4 overall. d5 is second most common, so completely fine. And then the most common moves for white here are d4, g3, c4 are basically by far the 3 most common, b3 and e3. Just since I'm kind of bad with this, to be completely honest, let's go through and learn the names of these, because I don't really know the names that well. I never really went through and did this exercise, so it's great that I get to catch up now. d4 here, okay, so queen's pawn opening, Zuckertort variation. All right, cool. Yeah, makes sense. d4, d5, knight f3, same thing. Okay. g3, King's Indian attack, okay. c4, ready gambit. b3, Nimzowitsch-Larsen attack. e3, it doesn't have a name. So anyways, yeah, so knight to f6 is, yeah, knight to f6 is the most common. Yep, and I think that's exactly the reason why. I think knight to f6 is the most flexible. Knight to f6 also turns it into a queen's pawn or English, or basically queen's pawn or, some type of English game. Basically d4 and c4 will be by far the most common moves on knight f6. So yeah, so let's see. On knight f6, most common becomes d4 number 1, c4 number 2, g3 number 3. Let's look at these ones. With knight to f6 played out of the ready, d4 is the Indian game knights variation, okay? This is the English opening king's knight variation, and this g3 king's Indian attack again. Okay, cool. Hey, thank you very much for the follow, Buzzer. Appreciate it. Thanks for joining the stream. But yeah, so this g3 facing off against, this g3 against this ready, that is interesting. So anyways, very interesting play. Knight to f6, c4, g6. So with this c4, g6, King's Indian defense, e6, I guess they call this English opening Anglo-Indian, c5, symmetrical variation of the English, right? And see if there are any other named ones. Honestly, like, this is so helpful for me. Like, I wish, again, like, I learned, basically how to play chess in a very tactics-heavy way. So, so this is actually this is embarrassingly helpful to me to learn all these openings. This is Caro-Kann defensive system, all right. B6, Queen's Indian formation. D6, Old Indian formation. And d5 here, Scandinavian, English opening Scandinavian defense. Interesting. Cool things to know. Didn't know All right. In this game, knight f3, d5, c4. So this is the ready gambit. Knight f6, e6, c6. Okay, bunch of options for white, or a bunch of options for black. Here, d takes c4, so this is ready gambit accepted. Okay. Most common by far here is d4. This is a full gambit, so full ready gambit. All right. So this turns into queen's. I guess this transposes into queen's gambit accepted. But what's unusual here is that after pawn takes d3, this isn't a. This is actually an interesting situation because they're labeling this the. No, I haven't read it. I haven't read it, Lauren. To be honest, I'm sure. I've seen Agard have some great, great insights, great books. But yeah, that is. I haven't read it. You think that's a good one that I should look at, Lauren? Probably would be really helpful. But you know what's kind of interesting here again is that okay, so you play c4, pawn takes c4, d4, and then this gets labeled as the queen's gambit accepted with knight to f3. But then if you play pawn takes d3, they're still calling this the queen's gambit accepted. And that's not really accurate, right? Like, isn't this this is an impossible position in the queen's gambit accepted? So that's kind of an interesting thing about this, this opening book and the programming behind this. Like, don't you think that it's kind of interesting they're calling this the queen's gambit accepted with the c takes d3 variation here? I think that's, I don't know, it's a little bit random, but I think that that's kind of cool. Like, they're calling this queen's gambit accepted, but if you listed this as an ICO or whatever ECO code queen's gambit accepted, you would have reached an illegal position from what queen's gambit accepted normally means. Yeah, no, it is. It's really interesting. I don't know. I think it's interesting. Kind of, I was expecting it to do something else, or it to like basically go back and say, okay, it's a ready again. But yeah. Anyways, interesting. I like this stuff too much, to be honest. Like all the programming things are actually really interesting to me. So yeah. So c4. Yeah. All of those are interesting, Lauren. Yeah, those are yeah, there's interesting things too. We reached a really cool position the other day where there was basically two knight moves that were the same, that were getting different lines. So there were like 600 knight moves, 600 move games in which knight to e7 was played, but 300 of them were under knight e7 and one of them was under g knight e7, and like 300 were under each, so it was sort of like a weird labeling thing. I like this stuff. Okay, I don't know that one, to be honest, Lauren. What's that? What's the theory on that one? So yeah, so d5, pawn takes c4, e3, bishop to e6. So this basically e3 is a basically second second rank move here. d4 is how this is normally played, and here knight to f6 gets played. So e3, and then for black, either knight to f6 or bishop to e6. Knight to f6 gives back the pawn immediately. Bishop to e6 holds on to the pawn. I guess I would probably think that, yeah, bishop to e6 is better. Holding on to this pawn if you can is good. I'm sure you can't literally hold on to it. Queen a4 always becomes a resource. But let's see what happens in this game with this early bishop to e6. How does white, deal with this? Knight to g5 seems right, but again, I would, black seems sort of committed to defending this pawn here. So I think that b5 might be good for black. Bishop to d5, okay. e4. This isn't what happened, or is this what happened? So this is what happened. Okay, so the main line here so basically pawn takes c4, e3, which is not the main line. And then main line for black is bishop to e6, on knight g5, bishop to d5. This all maintains the defense of this c4 pawn, e4, and then bishop to c6, e6, h6 for black. Queen to d6 was not on the list. Queen to d6 is pretty interesting, though. Actually, that's a creative way to play this as black. I think queen to d6, and you can then play queen to e5 and fork the queen and or fork the king and knight. But it does let the c5 the c4 pawn fall a little bit easily. What could have been better though? So after e4, bishop to c6, bishop takes c4, e6, d3, and basically black is fine. Interesting. e4, f5, pawn takes f5, king f7. Huh. That's interesting. Yeah, that is actually really interesting, Lauren. I didn't know that that was even a thing. These GMs seem to get away with some crazy moves, but yeah, they interesting. Yeah, that sounds like something that one probably shouldn't play in a game that they're trying to maximize chances of winning in. But interesting. Thank you for telling me that, Lauren. I'm always interested in learning more opening theory names. Okay, bishop to d5, e4, queen to d6. Yeah, queen to d6 is kind of a weird move. Yeah, that is kind of tactically unusual. Yeah, it does feel a little bit flimsy. I guess what the benefit of it though is that you're causing these doubled pawns on the d file for white. So if you play queen to d6, yes, you're losing the c4 pawn. But the advantage of queen to d6 is that you're causing white to fracture his pawn structure. The other moves here, so say, although to be fair, h6 here, which is considered to be the strongest, h6, e takes d5, h takes d5, this ends up in the same fractured pawn structure. So, yeah, I guess there's not really much in terms of queen to d6. Queen to d6 probably isn't super helpful. In fact, it probably leads to this, white getting an extra developing move, bishop to e2, or queen e2, and then queen takes e4. So let's see queen e5, and then queen e2 is better, and then queen takes, and then queen takes c4. So yeah, letting that queen get that extra move out on c4 is not super helpful. Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think you're right about that, Lauren. So yeah, this idea is not super strong. It's not super strong for black. It moves white's pieces more forward than they need to be. With this opening, you can play bishop to c6 is interestingly the main line here, but h6, which makes sense to me. H takes, bishop to c4. This brings white's pieces together less. Like, I think that having this bishop on c4 and this open file for the rook is better with than knight to f6 here. So yeah. So anyways, interesting. Yeah, interesting situation. Yeah. There's definitely some truth to that. Kind of setting up a tactic is a little bit lame, but queen takes b5, queen takes c4, c6, queen takes, pawn takes. This ends up being better for black. So, anyways, cool. Yeah, no, I agree. I think this is objectively worse. Better was the h6 line. So now black's got an edge here. Basically black has this, white has worse pawn structure. This isolated queen's pawn. But let's just look at this game from the start again. This all made sense. Bishop to d5 is main line. Queen to d6, okay, a little bit. I guess I wouldn't be too hard on queen to d6. I think you can get a reasonable position out of this. The queen on c4 becomes annoying because you have to respond to the threat that it's making. C6, but overall here, I think this ends up being pretty good for black. A6, pawn takes, e6. Black is fine. So how does black convert the endgame? So in terms of improving this game, I think so far black's played pretty solidly. Like, I don't think there've been tremendous inaccuracies here. I think this all sort of made sense. Knight to h5, king to d7 is getting knight to h5 is getting recommended for black, and king to d7 is getting recommended for black. Yeah, that eval looks pretty rough actually. Bishop to e7, but I think black is playing in a pretty intuitive way. This all sort of makes sense. king to d7 might have been an idea, to be honest. I sort of like king to d7 here. So bishop e7 and then king to d7. This ends up playing out, I think this is going to be good for black. I don't think king safety is that important to you. I mean, white has no mating threats for sure. And I don't think that having the king to d7 is going to be that much of a liability, ever. So I think having the king, you know, on to d7 and defending there makes sense as a defensive move. You know, I think basically, you know, you're basically pretty close to the end game, actually, since you've traded everything off. Win is, yeah, that's probably the right theme. You might also be able to win by clipping the ace-3 pawn, but definitely threats on the a3 pawn or the d4 pawn. Because I kind of like king. So first, the most important thing here is I don't like castling as a general plan. I think king to d7 is way better than castling. Like, not even like just based on the eval. Like, I think that having your king as an active piece here, you know, with castling, you're making the king so inactive. You're close enough to an endgame here that king to d7 is actually much better. You know, it can be used as an effective attacking piece. If you trade off a few more pieces, there's absolutely zero chances of drawing. Yeah, king to d7 looks better. Yeah, I like your plan again, Lauren. I think that trading off those pieces and turning it into an endgame where your king is more. I mean, with king to d7, your king is more active too. So, you know, I guess what I would think is, like, trade off the bishops if you can, or play bishop to d6, then get your king, like, in this direction. But you probably have to trade off a little bit before that happens. But if you can trade off the bishops, that is good. The only weakness is the backward pawn on c6. Yep. So king d7, I think, is better for black. That's what I would go for. So, good. Instead, castles, knight to b3, knight to d7, knight to a5, and black should be fine. This is kind of a crazy thing that happened. Huh. Okay. Whoa. All right. And then what happened? And then white hangs the rook. Okay. Yeah, well, just this there were many tactical improvements here. So let's go through this. So I actually thought the opening was fine. Yeah, so the first thing that I thought was interesting here was so queen to d6, we talked about it for a bit, not as efficient as h6. h6 was better there. Not the most impactful thing, but h6 is better than queen to d6 here. Now you have to deal with the threat of queen takes c4 and queen facing on c7. Okay, so that's the first thing. Queen takes, pawn takes, knight. Okay, so now black's winning, and here, but basically to here, I think black has played in a fairly reasonable way. But I think that you know, not just because of the eval, but because of the you know, but because of the actual position, king to d7 is not a move that makes your king safety jeopardized in any impactful way, and it will lead to your king being much more you know, active in the endgame. So this, I think, is a big improvement for black versus castles. This is the one that I think of as being really important. Yeah, and it defends c6, which is really good. The rook goes to a8, the pawn goes to a5, and basically black has good chances. So king to d7 over castles for sure is an improvement that I would suggest for black. Okay, bishop takes, knight to e7, and I think all of this was kind of not a good idea. So this king, basically, king to d7 kind of shows a weakness as early as this. Now you're sort of losing the c6 pawn, and you didn't want to do that. Yeah, so honestly, this became a problem pretty quick. Bishop to e5 and then knight to c4. Yeah, right? So bishop to e5 and then knight to c4 posting here. This ends up being a this probably is the best strategy. At least this prevents knight to e7. So I think that knight to e7 can't be allowed here is the main point. So king to d7 protects c6, and then trading pieces off, yeah, is good. But really, black pretty voluntarily gives up the c6 pawn. With king to d7 here, the c6 pawn is saved first, and then this with this knight to b6, and then basically it feels almost like the c6 pawn is lost as soon as castle. No, I think it is better. I think it's just objectively king d7 is just objectively better than castles. I think, I don't know. I mean, honestly, this c6 pawn feels almost lost after castles. I don't know I don't know how black's going to defend this, because the knight can't defend it, because the only place that can defend it is b8. So I don't know. Yeah, I would say black's probably just worse. Interesting though. Yeah, attacking the... Yeah. Yeah, no, it is a really interesting... I'm spending a good amount of time on this, but I think that even though the engine doesn't really care that much, king to d7 I think is just much better than castling. You need the defense on the c6, and you need the king activity, and it doesn't jeopardize your king safety at all. So I think king c7 is a much better move. Black ends up losing that c6 pawn pretty quickly. And then knight to c4 is a better option here. Knight to c4, the thing about knight to c4 is it stops knight to e7. The issue with bishop takes e5, or really any other move, I think knight to c4 is practically forced. But basically anything else, other than moving the king or rook, allows knight to e7 forking here. So knight to c4 was the move here. If bishop takes, then rook takes knight, and overall black has maintained an advantage, and also has this great knight outpost, which is going to be very helpful going forward. So bishop takes e5, and then from here I think black is sort of lost. This 4 or 5 points, not good. And then white makes bad endgame blunders. This it's drawn as soon as these pawns get so advanced, and this bishop defends the the queening square. But yeah, basically this rook, getting this bishop here was really good for black. d3 is played, and king d2 is a huge blunder. Letting this bishop play this extra move in is losing for white. So bishop to b4 defends that queening square, and defends an e7, and then the e pawn can push for black. So that's the thing. Yeah, so c6 for sure. Yeah, c6 definitely got a white basically made a big white got a good opportunity by winning that c6 pawn. But yeah, two big errors here. So the first or I guess 3 in this game. The first was queen to d6 is somewhat inefficient. It brings the queen to c4, and then you have to waste the tempo dealing with that threat of the queen to c4. You do it with c6, but white secures a 1-pawn advantage. Game continues. All this sort of makes sense. I don't think there's anything too terrible here. But king to d7 really is an improvement for black. King to d7 keeps your king active, doesn't jeopardize your king safety in any meaningful way, and so king to d7, sure. We can take a look at it, Lauren. I'm kind of curious in this game now. And then allowing c6 to be taken. So I don't know how salvageable c6 was, but after c6 or after castle's kingside, c6 feels almost lost to me. And then you have a tactical improvement, knight to c4, which doesn't allow white to win the exchange, which I think should be decisive. It isn't, but it should be. So yeah, knight to c4, and this is much better for black. And yeah, let's look at the opportunity for c5. So here, yeah, c5. What happens? So c5 and d takes c5, and then no, you could. Well, it looks like there's some tactical things going on. So but yeah, really good point, Lauren, for sure. Let's take a look. This is interesting. Um, yeah, this early c5. That makes sense from a positional perspective. The only thing that I'm thinking, so d takes c5, and then it has to be rook takes c5, right? Or at least, because bishop takes c5, b4, right? But rook takes c5, and then rook takes, bishop takes c5, rook c1, bishop to e7. Oh yeah, okay, and I guess black's fine here. Yep. Okay, so yeah, so that's one opportunity for black to play c5. What about c5 before rook to e8? So c5 here. That is probably right. What happens there? Yeah, that looks good. Pawn takes, bishop takes, rook to c1, and then what, like bishop to d4 probably? Bishop to d4, knight f6, castles maybe. But, yeah. Yeah, I like it. Yep, black is way better for center, and, on bishop to b6, rook to c6, I'm sort of curious about. Is this just kind of not helpful for white? Like bishop to d8. But yeah, I don't know. This is interesting. Yeah, no, thank you very much for yeah. No, it's great. These are really interesting positions to look over, Lauren. No, thank you so much for participating. It makes these really like much more interesting to look at. But yeah, that early c5 seems to be good for black in a few different places. So c6 looks necessary against this queen c4, and black spends some extra time on that. And then, yeah, and then here, yep, c5 looks playable on move 12 as opposed to knight to f6. And then again, I think c5 is playable on move 17 before b5. But yeah, you're making a great point, Lauren, for sure. These are super interesting to look at. And yeah, I like it. I mean, trading off the yes, no, you're completely right. You're completely right, Lauren. Like that, trading off this backwards pawn for this pawn on d4. It is trading off the weakest pawn for white for the weakest pawn for black, but it's still probably worth it for black. After that, there's no obvious weaknesses in black's pawn structure. I mean, this is the easiest target, I guess, but yeah. Interesting. Yeah, interesting. Good. I mean, good thought. I think that's that makes a lot of sense positionally. Is there? I mean, I'm wondering if there's any reason to not make that file open, but I don't know. Right. Yeah. No. It's not a huge weakness. Like, it's not a huge target. But I think black just does better by playing king to d7 here, defending the c6 pawn, and then black is just sort of comfortable. So yeah, you're making a great point, Lauren. That's another way that it could have gone. I think yeah, that provides a great theme for black to play. It improves black's pawn structure against white's, and yeah, I mean, I would want, again, like, improving this pawn structure. There's a lot of tactical things that go into it. But yeah, the biggest improvement that I see for black is actually king to d7 is playable here too. And it's also playable, so bishop to e7 here. But yeah, I'm sort of curious, I'm wondering why the engine isn't, the only thing is, I mean, I think c5 makes great sense. It makes a lot of sense, and it makes a lot of sense to get rid of your weakest pawn in this situation, and a pawn on a semi-open file. The only thing I'm curious about is why the engine isn't pushing harder for c5. Like in this situation, right? So this is basically I think this is probably the most intuitive situation to play c5. Why isn't the engine saying that you should play c5 here? After you play c5, or maybe I did it wrong. So like c5 here is the time. This is the time. So c5 is 1.17 versus 1.3. Yeah, here I think you're right. I think this is the point. This is the correct point to play c5 here, Lauren. But I think that playing c5 after rook to c8, and here c5 has a bad engine eval. I don't know why exactly, but let's figure it out. Pawn takes, rook takes. I don't know, to be honest. Probably the engine just figures that the knight is the next piece to get developed, and maybe the engine wants to develop it to c6. But yeah, really good point. Why is so two things I'm not getting about the engine here. First, why is c, and we can go back to the second one. Second one is, why is c5 so bad with the rook on c1 and the rook on c8? We'll take a look at that in a second. But why is knight to e7 rated so highly? Like, where's the knight supposed to go in the engine line here? Rook ac1, king d7, rook to c2, h5, rook to c1. Yeah, this knight seems to be unusually posted here, and it eventually comes to f5 and threatens this d4 pawn. So I guess it's probably that, to be honest. It's probably that threat of knight to e7, knight to, and then a timely like knight to f5 threatening white's isolated pawn. I think that's it, Lauren. Just looking at these engine lines. These engine lines delay that move forever, it looks like, but I think that's the idea. Knight to e7 is strong because it's not important to develop the bishop quickly, but it is good to get this this knight posted to f5 and threatening the d4 pawn. Right, yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah, for sure, Lauren. But basically the point of knight to e7 is this. I guess it's this knight to f5 move and this knight to f5 posting and this threat on d4. I guess it's that. But yeah, really good. I mean, really good question. I wouldn't have known. It would have taken me a lot longer without looking at the engine there. So interesting. Very interesting stuff. Yes, that is exactly right. Yep. But that said, c5 is still playable. The only thing is that c5 sort of, if you play c5 immediately, then it kind of diminishes the value of knight to f5, right? Because knight to f5 is still a powerful outpost, but if you play c5 immediately, then it doesn't have that threat on d4 anymore, I think. But yeah, really good points, Lauren. I think that's exactly the right way of looking at it. Yeah, no, me neither. Hey, welcome, Chessmaster Rishi. Thank you very much for joining the stream. We were just looking at basically the final parts of this game. Yeah, so this immediate c5. I also wanted to just look at why, so c5 I think is a great idea that you've established, Lauren. I think basically getting that, trading off this yeah, no, for sure, but I think that this is actually an intuitive one that makes me sort of think, and I feel like you could potentially get right in a game, like trading off this this basically backwards pawn for this isolated pawn on d4. That is a fix that black can make, and not one that I would immediately think to play. But if you're really paying attention to the pawn structure, then that move becomes a lot more obvious. So yeah, I like this idea, c5 here. It makes sense. Anyways, what I'm curious about is why c5 isn't good here. So what's the tactic behind this? D takes c5, knight to h5, bishop g5, h6. So far a lot of play on the king side. d4, bishop takes d4, knight to f4. But yeah, I guess, this... Yeah, this isn't so great, to be honest. Now white just has kind of a kingside, or basically liquidating it like that. Yeah, white can hold on to the c-pawn for too long at least. Yep, or it takes forever and is annoying. So bishop takes is not possible. What happens with rook takes here again? Rook takes, b4... And that looks pretty miserable, right? So rook takes c1, rook takes c1, knight to h5, I guess, is the best. But yeah, interesting. Yeah, so you can't, right? Yeah, but it is a good plan earlier. Like when you're recommending it. So C5 here is a very playable move, and it fixes your weakest pawn in your pawn chain. So interesting concepts. So yeah, going back to the game, the main error I think for so C5 was playable there. That was a good idea. King to D7 I think is the really identifiable error though. Like keeping this king involved in this game was important. Yeah, yeah. So king to d7 though over castles is one I think objective mistake that black makes. Um, well, it's good. I mean, it's a good opportunity to get to evaluate these things, and then knight to c4 saves this e7 square from getting being a square where the knight forks the king and the rook. So knight to c4 and basically or anything other than knight to c4 here, and white is in pretty bad shape. So yeah, very interesting themes. Very interesting. I'm just gonna go really quick through it, and then we'll wrap up. I thought this was all reasonable. Queen to d6 was slightly worse than the h6 move that's sometimes played and was in the opening book. Queen takes g5, cool. And then this all is good for this all is good for black. And then king to d7, either here, king to d7 is already playable as of move 16, but definitely king to d7 over castling was a big improvement. This c5 move that Lauren brought up is also very interesting. I think this was a good opportunity for it was a good opportunity for black to do either that or the knight e7. But yeah, so c5 or this knight e7, both of those are ideas that go after the center for black, and I think are basically pretty helpful here. So both of those are better than knight to f6, either knight e7 with the idea of bringing to f5 or c5 immediately. So yeah, and then but then king to d7 over castles, and that is it. And then knight to c4 over a move that allows knight to e2 check. But a number of things from this game, The Real. Thank you very much for sending this game. Always appreciate it. Thanks so much to everyone for being here. Yeah, thanks Lauren for being kind of engaged in this conversation. You suggested a great great set of moves to look over, and yeah, they're really helpful for this analysis. Yeah, so thanks everyone for sending everything in. Thank you all very much for being here. My next stream is at 8 a.m. Eastern tomorrow morning in about 8.5 hours. So yeah, thanks all very much for being here, and thank you all very much for contributing material to the stream. Great. Have a good night, everyone. Thanks a lot for being here. I'll see you later. Bye.